pandemic has exasperated the spiritual alienation and emotional lack that defines consumer society. There's going to have to be some kind of reckoning with that at some point. And this, by the way, affects both the left and the right probably a little bit differently, but it affects it both just as intensely, because both the left and the right are captured or subsumed by the overall dynamism of consumer capitalism. When you're caught up in a system where your whole life centers around enjoyment, when it centers around personal satisfaction and buying things or having experiences or doing things that are locked into a certain kind of logic that has to do with capitalism, has to do with technology, but it also has to do with this kind of trying to satisfy the insatiable nature of human desire, disturbs the functioning of that system in a very real way, in the sense that you can't go outside, you have to wear masks, you have to social distance. Maybe you lost your job because your company shut down. You can't go to your favorite restaurant. You can't go to whatever it is. That is a really big effect on the desiring machinery, that's what I would call it, of American society. And that, of course, leads to all kinds of problems, and not just depression and anxiety. It leads to violence, and there was a survey done in June, I think it was June 20th, of young Americans between the ages of 16 and 24, and it was something startling, like 1 out of 4, it was either 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 young people had said they had seriously considered committing suicide over the past 30 days. I mean, that's a shocking statistic, that we are living in a culture that 1 out of every 4 young people literally wants to die. I mean, that's a shocking statistic. And it's a failure of the way American society is currently being structured. And the way I would call it, the way I see it, it's the combination of computational power, which is we see in our smartphones and social media, and really the whole way businesses are organized today, that has become linked to the logic and power of global capitalism. And that is producing, without question, an existential crisis for most, especially young people, most especially.
Exactly, and you and I have talked about this in our conversations on gentrification, where we saw it up front, personal, and close to living in South Boston, in an area that was once a neighborhood that turned into basically a dormitory for intellectual workers. And so, and these are the things that were on my mind before COVID. People would want to start discussing sexism, racism, blah, blah, blah. And I would say, well, first of all, we may have different agendas, because what is on the top of my mind every single day, number one, and one of the things that I commend you on is you're addressing the heroin situation. I said we have a crisis with drugs in this society. We have an opioid crisis. We have teenage suicide as a crisis. We have school shootings. We have mass shootings. We have the isolation of the old, suicide among the elderly. I said, these are all issues that I'd like to talk about, and what you seem to be so concerned about are income, and whether or not you can, the inequality of incomes or whatever. So we can't even begin to have a platform to launch a discussion. And this is what you're talking about now, is like the mental health and the spiritual health and emotional health, psychological health of the society, and especially our young people. If they don't have optimism and reason raised in debt for living, what have we done as a society?
Yeah, and a lot of that can be explained. For instance, if you use a neighborhood like South Boston, or really just urban American life in general, is the shift from the quote-unquote old neighborhood to the gentrified Disneyland situation that's happening now. Something like COVID is going to undermine that process, because I think a lot of people are going to realize that living in that hyper-competitive urban environment, in which your whole existence as a human being is structured by flows of technology and personal productivity, that just isn't going to work anymore. And that's why I think in places like Boston and places like New York City and probably in other places, you're seeing this kind of this exodus from the city center, this exodus from gentrified neighborhoods to try to find a house in the suburbs. Now, I don't necessarily think that's the answer at all, because if you don't change the metastructure of the situation, you're only going to reproduce gentrification in suburbs, which is more than possible. A lot of these inner city neighborhoods that have been transformed over the past 2 decades by the processes and discourses of gentrification, they're going to be, once the dust settles on COVID-19, I think the implications for urban American life, there's going to be some real questions about what are we doing here, you know? And
Yep.
For as devastating a pandemic is, and obviously we're living through it, it truly is. And you know, I guess this is true for any trauma that you experience. There's always a positive side, in the sense that you have the capacity to symbolically reorganize your experience in your life. So I think that COVID-19, yes, it will raise a lot of questions, and people will be angry, and people will be hurt. And, of course, that opens up a space to reorganize not only our personal space and our personal lives, but also social space and public space. As I mentioned earlier, there will absolutely be players and forces and political or corporate power that won't want to see that they'll want to use this not to open up a new space of collective public healing and a new way to organize American culture, but to reproduce the, I guess, trauma or oppression that we're seeing right now with some of the with what's happening in with COVID-19. So it's a very dangerous. I mean, it's really a dangerous situation right now in many ways. You know, it's dangerous psychically for the individual. It's certainly dangerous economically for the entire infrastructure of the entire global economy. And then you may be seeing that right now with a flare up on the Chinese-Indian border. There's also a potential for geopolitical problems as well. You know, I don't know if this is going to lead to World War III, but if we look back at the intersection of the Spanish flu and World War I, it would be naive for us not to think some kind of war could emerge out of the situation. It'd be very naive to think that. Your
conversation has flowed to a point I think is, we talk about later. You're a storyteller, you're a great storyteller. You've done documentaries. In fact, that's how we first met, was at the Apple store when I saw you editing one of your videos, your documentaries. And I did a lot of reading, started to become a storyteller myself, and I found out I had to go to people like Joseph Campbell and read about the hero's journey, and a series of books that I thought that took that whole premise and made it really, intelligible for a person who wants to write a craft of screenwriting or storytelling. Was the hero's journey, and I think this is kind of what's under here. So, in any good story, you can't have a story without adversity. You can't have a story. All stories start off in a point of stasis, where you meet the characters, you see the setting, and you're introduced to normal situation, and then an inciting incident comes along, and in that the hero or the heroine is thrown into an upside-down world, and then has to make internal decisions. Does the individual decide to stay the same, stasis, and by doing that, he'll die? Or does he have to make the decision, just like a caterpillar turning into, metamorphosizing into a butterfly? Does he make the leap and die as a caterpillar and reborn as a new character to deal with the situation? And in all of the situations, the real journey is never about the tangible goal that he thinks it is setting out. It's always about the intangible things that he learned, like love, forgiveness, courage, valor, whatever. And I think that's what we're seeing here is stasis, antithesis, and then synthesis. What is going to be the synthesis of this? And who are going to be the people, the individuals that can weather the storm and come through this? And so I'd love your take on all of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that that COVID is definitely part of a very long historical process, and I don't think you can analyze COVID in and of itself as if you're going to use the Campbell motif of the hero's journey, because it's part of a much longer development in both American and global society. But I do think, to your point, that we're still in the middle of this, right? This is still going on, and it's kind of like when your house is burning down, you can't really see how bad things are. You have to wait till the flames go out to really see the damage that has been done. So I think that in some way, we don't really know what's happened yet. I think that once the virus either goes away or it gets to a minuscule level, then what happened. But, in a situation like this, we're still getting 30,000, 40,000 cases a day, and we're coming into the cold months where it could get exponentially worse. I think it's tough to really get a grasp on it. The best thing that we can do right now is try to live one day at a time. I listened to I read an article about Pope Francis gave a sermon 2 weeks ago, and he talked about the need for human beings to become more humble and more not so caught up in the world. And that, of course, is that's the source of every major religion. But it seems a particularly good advice in the situation in 21st century living in the context of 21st century planetary capitalism, where so much of, certainly in America, so much of the energy directed by individuals is towards economic productivity, branding themselves, social media profiles, things of utility, aesthetics or spiritual matters or communal matters. So I think that when dealing with such a stressful situation, we have to figure out a way to let go of a lot of the quote-unquote worldly attachments that we have. We've kind of been through that already, living in Peru for the past 5 years. You know what I mean? So this hasn't been overly difficult for me to adjust. But I think that, for instance, if you were working in a city and you're working for an architectural firm, let's say, and you're making $175,000 a year, and everything's good in January, and then all of a sudden March hits, and your business goes down, you have student debt, you're renting a condo or own a condo or whatever, and all of a sudden you have these problems that you didn't have before. And I think there's a lot of people like that who were living a kind of chasing the American dream, and of course the American dream is becoming harder and harder to chase as time goes on. And then when you come into contact with an external situation like a pandemic that really ruptures that capacity, that can be very painful for people, very, very painful. And the natural reaction is to try to chase the dream even faster, to try to engage in strategies where you can beat the market, or you can, versus the much more logical strategy, which would be to figure out a way to disengage from the system. And that, but at the same time, a lot of people don't want to do that. A lot of people don't think they have the courage or the strength or the wherewithal to do it. And if you look at the COVID-19 and the world in crisis, we all have to make an exit from this system. We all do. And we have to do it individually, for sure. But we also have to do it on, I guess, the political level is what I would say. Because the system that we're living in now is, without question, steering the human race into a bad situation that's going to become progressively worse as time goes on. I mean, the first week of November, I think everybody knows there's going to be riots on the street. I think every single person knows that. And that's never really happened in American history before, where that the transfer of power is going to be incredibly problematic, whether Trump is reelected and gets reinaugurated or Biden and Harris win. Either way, there is going to be significant problems.